Margaret Chen had worked as a secretary at Pinnacle Solutions for 32 years. She'd been there since the company was small, since before it became a major corporation. She'd seen the company grow from a startup with 30 employees to a major tech company with 2,000 employees. Margaret knew everything about Pinnacle Solutions. She knew the history of every client. She knew the details of every major project. She knew where the bodies were buried, literally the corporate secrets and scandals that could destroy the company if they ever became public. Margaret was also 62 years old, and on a Tuesday morning, she was called into her boss's office and told that she was being fired. "We're restructuring," her boss, David Harrison, said coldly. "We're eliminating some positions to improve efficiency and reduce costs. Your position has been eliminated. You have 2 weeks to find another job, and we'll give you a basic severance package." Margaret was shocked. She'd given 32 years to this company. She'd never missed a day of work. She'd taken a lower salary than she could have earned elsewhere because she believed in the company and in being part of its growth. And now she was being discarded like yesterday's garbage. "Why?" Margaret asked, her voice shaking. "I've been loyal to this company. I've never complained. I've always done excellent work." "You're at retirement age," David said bluntly. "Younger employees are cheaper and more technologically savvy. It makes business sense to replace you with someone less expensive." Margaret left the office in a daze. She told her co-workers what had happened. Many of them were shocked. Many of them were upset. But nobody did anything. Nobody spoke up. They were all afraid that speaking up might cause them to lose their jobs too. That night, Margaret sat in her small apartment, devastated. She'd been planning to work for another 5 years before retiring. She needed the income. She had medical bills. She had a mortgage on her apartment. Losing this job could destroy her financially. She had no idea that what happened next would shock the entire company and the entire industry. Margaret Chen had been born in Taiwan and had immigrated to the United States when she was 25 years old. She'd worked various jobs to learn English and to adjust to American culture. She'd attended night school and had earned her high school diploma and then some college credits. When she'd started at Pinnacle Solutions as a secretary, the company had been revolutionary. They were developing cutting-edge software solutions. They had brilliant engineers and creative minds. But they were also chaotic and disorganized. Margaret had brought order to that chaos. She'd created filing systems. She'd organized meetings. She'd kept track of details that nobody else was paying attention to. She'd been the glue that held the company together in its early years. As the company grew, Margaret's role had evolved. She'd become more than just a secretary. She'd become the corporate historian. She'd kept track of everything. She'd maintained relationships with long-term clients. She'd remembered the context and background of important decisions. Margaret had never married. She'd never had children. Pinnacle Solutions had been her life's work. The company had been her family. And now that family had abandoned her. Margaret had a degree in accounting, though she'd never pursued it professionally. She'd been content being a secretary, being the support person behind the scenes. But she had skills. She had experience. She had institutional knowledge worth millions of dollars. On the day she was fired, Margaret went home and did something that surprised everyone who knew her. She went to her computer and started writing. Margaret wrote down everything she knew. She wrote about the company's founding and the decisions that had been made. She wrote about the clients and their histories. She wrote about the projects and their details. She wrote about the corporate scandals, the corners that had been cut, the clients who'd been overcharged, the employees who'd been treated unfairly. She wrote about everything. It took her 3 weeks to document everything. She wrote over 500 pages of detailed information about Pinnacle Solutions' 32-year history. Then Margaret did something that shocked everyone when they found out about it. She contacted a journalist. Margaret had always been careful, had always followed company rules, had always been loyal. But loyalty works both ways. When the company had discarded her, loyalty no longer applied. Margaret met with an investigative journalist named Rebecca Santos who worked for a major news organization. Margaret gave Rebecca everything, all 500 pages of documentation. Rebecca read through the material, and her eyes got bigger with every page. What Margaret had documented was massive. There were allegations of corporate fraud, of misleading clients, of environmental violations, of employment discrimination. "Are you willing to go on the record?" Rebecca asked Margaret. Margaret thought about it carefully. She knew that going public could destroy her chances of ever working in the tech industry again. She knew that Pinnacle Solutions had expensive lawyers who would come after her. She knew there could be legal consequences. But Margaret also knew that what the company had done was wrong. Firing her because she was 62 years old was age discrimination. Firing her while she was the only employee who knew important information was foolish and reckless. And Margaret had decided that she was done being loyal to a company that didn't value her. "Yes," Margaret said. "I'm willing to go on the record." The investigation took 3 months. Rebecca worked with other journalists to verify every claim that Margaret had made. They interviewed former employees. They reviewed financial records. They consulted with legal experts. They built an airtight case documenting decades of corporate misconduct at Pinnacle Solutions. During those 3 months, Margaret applied for jobs. She interviewed at other companies. But her experience was depressing. At 62 years old, with only secretary experience, she couldn't find another job. Companies wanted younger workers. They said she was overqualified, or not quite what we're looking for. The real reason was age discrimination, and Margaret knew it. She was struggling financially. She was taking out loans to pay her mortgage. She was worried about what would happen to her. She was questioning whether her decision to go public with the investigation had been the right one. Then one morning, the story broke. Major tech company involved in decades of fraud and misconduct, the headlines read. Rebecca's investigation was front-page news. The article detailed fraud, environmental violations, employment discrimination, and systematic deception of clients. The story was picked up by other news outlets. It went viral on social media. It became the subject of discussions on business news channels. It was discussed on podcasts and radio shows. Pinnacle Solutions' stock price crashed. Investors who'd believed the company was legitimate and ethical were shocked and angry. They started selling their stock. Within 2 days, the company's market value had dropped by 40%. The board of directors called an emergency meeting. They were in panic mode. They knew that this investigation was going to have massive consequences. They decided to fire David Harrison, the CEO who'd fired Margaret. They decided to launch their own internal investigation. They decided to hire outside consultants to audit their practices. They decided to implement reforms and transparency measures. But they also did something else. They realized that Margaret Chin was the source of the investigation. They realized that the detailed information that Rebecca Santos had could only have come from someone with deep knowledge of the company's inner workings. David Harrison and the board of directors met with their legal team and their crisis management team. They talked about whether they should sue Margaret. They talked about whether they should pursue legal action against her for revealing confidential company information. But then something unexpected happened. One of the board members, an older woman named Susan Martinez, spoke up. "We fired her," Susan said. "We fired a 62-year-old woman because we wanted to save money. We treated her with no respect after 32 years of service. And now we're shocked that she's telling the truth about us." She looked around the room. "She didn't do anything wrong," Susan continued. "We did something wrong. We treated her badly. We discriminated against her based on her age. And now we're dealing with the consequences. But instead of trying to punish her further, maybe we should acknowledge that we made a mistake. Maybe we should make this right." The other board members were silent. They understood that Susan was right. They understood that suing Margaret would only make things worse. It would only confirm that they were the bad guys in this story. So they made a different decision. The board of directors called Margaret Chin. "Margaret," the chairman of the board said on the phone, "we owe you an apology. We fired you unfairly. We treated you badly. And you've exposed years of misconduct at our company. We'd like to meet with you to discuss how we can make this right." Margaret agreed to meet with them. She didn't know what to expect. When Margaret arrived at Pinnacle Solutions headquarters, she was brought into a conference room where the entire board was waiting. The chairman, Susan Martinez, stood up when Margaret walked in. "Margaret," Susan said, "I'm going to be honest with you. We fired you because you were old. We wanted to save money. We didn't care about your loyalty or your years of service. We treated you like you didn't matter." She paused, collecting herself. "But we've realized over these past few months that we were wrong," Susan continued. "We were wrong to fire you. We were wrong to treat you that way. And we're grateful that you had the courage to speak up about what's been happening in our company." The board presented Margaret with a proposal. They offered her a settlement of $5 million, significantly more than her salary and pension would have been. They offered her a formal apology. They offered her the opportunity to work as a consultant for the company for as long as she wanted, helping them implement reforms and transparency measures. They also offered something else. They offered to create a fellowship in Margaret's name, the Margaret Chin Fellowship, that would provide scholarships and mentorship to secretaries and administrative workers who wanted to advance their careers. Margaret was overwhelmed. She didn't know what to say. "Why are you doing this?" Margaret asked. "Because we want to do the right thing," Susan said. "Because we know we treated you badly. Because we want to make sure that what happened to you doesn't happen to other people. And because, quite frankly, we realized how much you meant to this company when you were gone. We realized how much you contributed. And we want to acknowledge that." Margaret accepted the settlement. She accepted the consulting position. She agreed to work with the company to implement reforms. But more importantly, Margaret's story started to change how other companies approached age discrimination and employee treatment. The investigation into Pinnacle Solutions exposed not just that company's misconduct, but also highlighted a broader problem in the tech industry. Age discrimination was rampant. Older workers were being pushed out to make room for cheaper younger workers. This wasn't just happening at Pinnacle Solutions. It was happening everywhere. Margaret's case became a catalyst for change. Other people started coming forward about age discrimination they'd experienced. Lawsuits were filed. Regulatory agencies started investigating tech companies more closely. Laws were proposed to strengthen protections for older workers. Margaret became a spokesperson for workers' rights. She gave interviews. She spoke at conferences. She worked with nonprofit organizations focused on fair employment practices. She became known not as the secretary who'd exposed corporate fraud, but as the woman who'd fought back against age discrimination and won. With her settlement money, Margaret started a nonprofit organization called Second Wind. The organization provided support, legal assistance, and job training for workers over 50 who'd been discriminated against based on their age. Margaret hired a small team to run the organization. Within 2 years, Second Wind had helped over 500 workers. Some of them won settlements in court. Some of them found new jobs. Some of them started their own businesses. All of them were given the support and the belief that their age didn't determine their value. 5 years after being fired, Margaret Chin had completely transformed her life and the lives of thousands of people. She was no longer a secretary. She was no longer invisible. She was a respected figure in discussions about employment rights, age discrimination, and corporate accountability. At her organization's 5-year anniversary celebration, Margaret stood before a room full of people whose lives had been changed by Second Wind. There were people who'd been fired from their jobs because they were too old. There were young people whose parents or grandparents had been helped. There were lawyers and advocates who'd worked on cases. There were members of the media who'd covered stories of age discrimination. Margaret gave a speech. 5 years ago, I was fired from a job I'd worked for 32 years, Margaret said. I was fired because I was 62 years old. The company wanted younger, cheaper workers. They didn't care about my loyalty or my contributions. They just saw me as an expense to be eliminated. She paused, looking around the room. At first, I was devastated, Margaret continued. I was scared. I was angry. I was uncertain about what I would do. I applied for jobs, but nobody would hire me. I was experiencing age discrimination in job interviews, just like I'd experienced it at my old company. She took a deep breath. But then I decided that instead of being a victim, I would be an advocate, Margaret said. I decided that if I couldn't get a job, I would do something that mattered. I would tell the truth about what was happening at Pinnacle Solutions. And I would fight for other people going through what I was going through. Margaret's voice became emotional. What happened to me was terrible, she said. Being fired was one of the worst experiences of my life. But it led to something bigger than me. It led to the creation of this organization. It led to helping over 500 people who'd been discriminated against because of their age. It led to a national conversation about age discrimination. She looked directly at the audience. Here's what I want you to know, Margaret continued. Your age doesn't determine your value. Your worth isn't measured by how young you are or how cheap you are. Your worth is measured by your character, your work ethic, your intelligence, your experience, your wisdom. She paused. And here's what I want companies and employers to know, Margaret said. When you fire someone because they're old, you're not just making a financial decision. You're making an ethical decision. You're deciding that profit matters more than people. You're deciding that you don't value loyalty or experience. And you're creating a situation where you might lose more than you save. She pointed to the audience. This room is full of people whose lives were changed because someone, maybe me, maybe someone else, decided to fight back against age discrimination, Margaret concluded. We've won in court. We've found new jobs. We've started new businesses. We've proved that we have value, despite what corporate America said about us. After the speech, Margaret was approached by David Harrison, her former CEO at Pinnacle Solutions. David had been forced to resign from the company after the investigation. He'd struggled to find work because of his reputation. But he'd also undergone a profound transformation. Margaret, David said, I want to apologize. I want to apologize for firing you. I want to apologize for treating you the way I did. I was wrong. I was greedy. I was short-sighted. David paused. I'm working with Second Wind now, he continued. I'm teaching courses about ethical leadership. I'm helping companies understand why treating employees well makes business sense, not just moral sense. What happened to you? What happened to me? What happened to Pinnacle Solutions? It could have been prevented if I'd had the values and the ethics I should have had. Margaret listened to David's apology. She understood that he was trying to atone for his mistakes. She understood that people could change. I forgive you, Margaret said. And I'm grateful that you're using your experience to teach other leaders. That matters. Margaret's story continued to ripple through the business world. Companies started reconsidering their policies toward older workers. Investors started asking companies about age diversity in their workforce. HR departments started being trained about age discrimination laws and ethical practices. The Margaret Chin Fellowship that Pinnacle Solutions had created was thriving. It had provided scholarships to over 200 secretaries and administrative workers who wanted to advance their careers. Many of them had gone on to become managers, directors, and executives. Margaret worked with Second Wind for the rest of her career. She didn't just help individual workers. She also worked to change laws. She testified before Congress about age discrimination. She worked with legislators on proposals to strengthen protections for older workers. She became known as an expert on employment rights and corporate accountability. When Margaret turned 75 years old, she decided to step back from day-to-day work at Second Wind, though she continued as a board member and advisor. At her retirement celebration, Susan Martinez, who'd been on the board that fired her and had also been instrumental in making things right, gave a speech. Margaret came to our company as a secretary 32 years ago, Susan said. She was there through the company's founding and growth. She was loyal, hardworking, and dedicated. We repaid that loyalty by firing her. Susan's voice became emotional. But Margaret didn't respond to that injustice with bitterness or hatred, Susan continued. She responded with courage and integrity. She exposed what we'd done wrong. And then she used her experience to fight for thousands of other people. She transformed something terrible into something meaningful. Susan looked directly at Margaret. You've taught us all something important, Susan said. You've taught us that age is not a liability. You've taught us that loyalty and experience have value. You've taught us that we have a responsibility to treat people with dignity and respect. Thank you for everything you've done. The audience stood up and applauded. Margaret sat there, tears streaming down her face. She thought about the young woman who'd immigrated from Taiwan 50 years ago, who'd worked as a secretary, who'd been invisible in many ways. She thought about how one moment of injustice had led to a lifetime of advocacy and change. She thought about all the people she'd helped through Second Wind. She thought about the laws that had been changed. She thought about the conversation that was now happening in corporate America about treating older workers fairly. Most importantly, she thought about how being fired, which had felt like the worst thing that could have happened, had actually been the beginning of the most meaningful work of her life. ## direct hit final call to action. If this story moved you, if it made you think about justice and fairness and the value of age and experience, then I need you to do something right now. Hit that like button. Share this video with someone. It could be someone who's been discriminated against because of their age, someone who's worried about losing their job as they get older, or someone who needs to be reminded that people have value no matter how old they are. Subscribe to our channel so you never miss these stories about standing up for what's right and creating change through courage and integrity. Because here's the truth. Age discrimination is real and it's rampant. Older workers are being pushed out of jobs not because they can't do the work, but because younger workers are cheaper. Companies are making short-term financial decisions that hurt real people and ultimately damage their own organizations. And most people are too scared to speak up about it. If you're an older worker who's been discriminated against, please know that you have rights. Please know that there are organizations and lawyers who can help you. Please know that speaking up isn't disloyal. It's standing up for what's right. Please reach out to organizations like the EEOC, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or nonprofit organizations focused on workers' rights. And if you're in a position of leadership, if you make hiring and firing decisions, please think about the value of experience. Please think about the wisdom that comes with age. Please think about the long-term cost of replacing loyal, experienced workers with cheaper, younger workers. Because that short-term savings often comes at a much higher long-term cost. Leave a comment below and tell us. Have you ever experienced age discrimination? Have you seen someone get fired unfairly and speak up about it? Have you witnessed or been part of a situation where doing the right thing had positive consequences? Share your story in the comments. Your experience might inspire someone else to stand up for what's right. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell. We release new stories every single week about real people who fought injustice, who stood up for what's right, and who created change through courage and integrity. We'll see you in the next video. Stay strong, stay just, and remember, your age doesn't determine your value. Your character does. Thank you so much for watching.